Haiti, land of hunger, gang violence, corruption, and chaos. Ever since the Republic of Haiti was founded, the Haitian people have been stuck in a constant cycle of exploitation and violence. Right? Well, not exactly. The pattern of dysfunction that we see at present actually has a defined beginning, and no, it wasn't the French naval return and accompanying independence debt. When you actually look through the historical record, you'll find that until recently, Haiti was a country of engineers, sailors, farmers, and craftspeople. So follow me as we explore these lesser told stories of the Haitian Republic and the systems that conspired to tear it apart. It's Jelly Like Jam, you know who I am. So I won't even touch the independence debt today. We'll be beginning exclusively from the birth of the modern Haitian Republic in 1859, about 40 years after the independence debt would have been imposed. So, an uninitiated observer might look at this period from 1860 to 1910 and gawk at the fact that we had 20 heads of state in about 50 years, ignoring such entities as the Roman Republic and the French Revolution. But I argue that this is actually a symptom of a healthy democracy, where the populace, once they become dissatisfied by the ruling party, have the ability to revoke their consent of the governed in any meaningful capacity. Now, in the same vein, longer-lasting presidents who, to some degree, were able to maintain consent of the governed, like Florville Hippolyte and Lysias Salomon, were able to launch some large-scale infrastructure projects. Haiti was building out and trying to industrialize as rail mania was progressing throughout the rest of the world. People think that the independence debt was just the end of Haitian history and that ever since we've just been stuck in the colonial washing machine. But that's not really true. Even in spite of the independence debt, Haiti was still able to survive and progress independently of the major colonial powers. Like, for one, the Republic of Haiti was mostly food self-sufficient to varying degrees from about the 1810s onwards, with our first grain exports being shipped around the Caribbean under President Pétion. And that's not exactly a difficult feat for a tropical country with a year-round growing season. Now, in addition, Haiti would build its economy around coffee, textiles, fishing, and timber. And to facilitate industry within the Republic, we began connecting almost every major city by rail. It all started in Port-au-Prince with a 760 mil narrow-gauge tramway driven by 040 Equus Caballos locomotives. Now, if you want to learn more about the rail system that was so callously murdered and butchered by the agents that I am about to describe, I suggest you check out Dr. Georges Michel's Railways in Haiti. They expanded the Port-au-Prince tram line to Léogâne, the Dominican border, and started an unfinished line to Pétionville. In 1896, they began building a 1067 mil, 42-inch, aka Japan or South Africa gauge, train line that would connect the north by steam engine with lines from Ocap inland to Grand Rivière du Nord, and then to farmlands in Baon, with several extensions planned for the future. In fact, here we have an approximate map of what the Haitian rail network would have looked like around 1910. Blue represents completed lines, red is planned connections, and then orange is incomplete construction. In addition to some smaller rail systems made to service individual farming communities. So, if we're being completely honest here, IT was doing considerably better than a lot of European countries in terms of both technological development and food sovereignty. Now, here's where it went left. So President Vibrant Guillaume was the flavor of the trimester, with his run at dictatorship going especially poorly, and long story short, it ended with Haitians breaking into the French embassy, beating him senseless, and then tossing his limp body into a crowd to be desecrated and paraded around town as the people saw fit. The worst part is, an anti-American was poised to take power. Now, naturally, these complex geopolitical maneuvers require immense subtlety and whatever. Now, guess how long they waited to land soldiers on the coast of Haiti? They were there within hours. Now, nominally, the occupation was to, quote, reestablish peace and order. and has nothing to do with any diplomatic negotiations of the past or future. End quote. But that's a pretty hard sell when within months of arriving, they attempt to rewrite the Haitian constitution to allow them to establish business interests in the country, deport all the Germans, their political opponents, and this is before hating Germans becomes a based political stance, just straight up rob the national treasury and then privatize the Haitian National Bank. The overseeing officer on the task of drafting a new Haitian constitution was Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who was Assistant Secretary of the Navy under President Woodrow Wilson. Now, being Secretary of the Navy means that he was in charge of the Marine occupation of IAT. Now, FDR is famously the best liberal president, quote unquote. So, how did his foreign policy in IAT shake out during this time period? Well, they introduced a new constitution drawn up by FDR, but IAT's prime minister didn't want to present the new constitution to parliament, so they installed their resident puppet in Philippe d'Artigonave, henceforth referred to as Philip D, so nobody ask who that is, because you won't like my response. After parliament didn't want to institute this new constitution, they dissolved parliament, elected a new one, try again, fail, rinse, repeat, this time dissolving parliament at gunpoint because, you gotta make a point. But then realize maybe representative democracy is inherently flawed somehow. So you decide that it'd be much easier to convince the Haitian people directly of how good this new constitution is for their personal interests and well-being. So you open it up to a popular referendum. A good portion of the population is illiterate at this point, so a white card means yes and a black card means no. You get a white card and you drop it in the box. Done. Democracy has been achieved. Don't analyze any further. But what about the black cards? I don't know. Maybe ask the US Marine who doesn't speak Haitian, maybe? I'm sure these guys that just spent the last year spraying crowds with lead and dismantling our government will be helpful. By the way, IAT wouldn't get its legislative branch back for another 13 years. Yes, a whole 13 years without the ability to legislate on its own behalf. Now, around World War I, like 5 to 10 years into the occupation, America tried to convert IAT into a rubber state to supply the war effort. The Haitian American Society of Agricultural Development, henceforth referred to as SHADA, was later established as a national natural resource company designed to serve American interests. They started digging around in Haitian law and found out that the government can institute corvée labor at will. Now, nobody actually uses this clause throughout Haitian history because it's basically like putting your administration on death row. But the US don't have to worry about winning any elections, now do they? So the American forces saw this and were like, cool, and then brought back corvée labor. But I haven't really answered the question, what is corvée labor yet? Well, it's one of those idiomatic phrases in French, intrinsically tied to a certain cultural context, so it's kinda hard to translate directly, but modern scholars tend to translate it as, you, build this banana plantation, build this road to the banana plantation, and direct all payment inquiries to our HR team of Horace Smith and Daniel Wesson. Eminent domain acquisitions, of course, were fair, honest, and dignified for the displaced families, with a total of $175,000 allotted for compensation packages. That $175K would be divided amongst 40,000 displaced families. And I swear to God, if anybody enters a single digit into your calculator, I'm smacking the shit out of you. It's adequate. Just trust me. So as you can imagine, the Haitian people weren't very fond of all this and mounted a guerrilla resistance called the Cacos, named after a native bird known for its ambush tactics. This is a large part of why the USA's plan to turn IAT into a giant rubber plantation failed. First was the extremely rugged and mountainous landscape, but also defiance from the working class was just far too strong, with rebellion taking the form of work slowdowns, broken tools, walkouts, worker abandonment, and in extreme cases, guerrilla warfare. This was a Hydra-type situation where chopping off any one head will cause 3 more to grow because yesterday's civilians, tomorrow's insurgents, today's atrocities. You know the deal. like any other equally unwinnable insurgency war. They could quell the uprisings for a few months at a time before they invent a new war crime and people gotta start rioting again. This project can be pretty well summed up with the following quote that NAACP Secretary Herbert Seligman published in a newspaper called The Nation. Military camps have been built throughout the island. The property of the natives has been taken for military use. Haitians carrying a gun were, for a time, shot on sight. Machine guns have been turned on crowds of unarmed natives, and United States Marines have, by accounts which several of them gave me in casual conversation, not troubled to investigate how many were killed or wounded. Now, I'm not going to bother elaborating on his role in the preceding events, but if you want some fun evening reading, look up Smedley Butler's Gangster for Capitalism. He's an example of a tragic hero who finds out that the cause to which they dedicated their entire life was really just an organized crime ring and he was just the muscle without a brain. So I'm going to be jumping back and forth in time for this next section, so I should get introductions out of the way early. Papa Doc Duvalier was a doctor who gained his name treating all of the death and disease brought by the U.S. occupation. After they left, he managed to use his clout to leverage a presidential campaign. So he ran for president, and when he won, he wasted no time in establishing a cult of personality as a benevolent and untouchable divine leader. Something, 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 chosen by God, yada, 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 mystical powers, whatever. Now, clout wasn't the only gift he got from the U.S. occupation. He also got a few pages from the American playbook. Remember that farce of a vote from earlier with the U.S. Marines? He recreated it twice in subsequent elections before finally bailing on the trappings of democracy and declaring himself President Faux Life. The Tonton Macoute, or English translation Uncle Gunnysack, were his secret police, drawing on an old Haitian folklore character who kidnaps naughty children. Like, this was a very paternalistic, Shrek-ass dictator if you couldn't tell. And these are the most infamous secret police in Haitian memory. If you want to get deeper into the Tonton Macoute, the book Written in Blood is a great resource on Haitian history, especially around the 60s and 70s. So, Papa Doc was propped up financially by the US because he was anti-communist and it was the 1950s. That, and any exploitative US industry that wanted to set up shop, could get cheap labor and materials. And there was a rather macabre case where the materials were just people. And no, I'm not talking about slavery. For that, the people would still have to be alive. But that's a whole other discussion, and if you want to know more, I actually go into a little bit deeper detail in this video here. Now, the train system is actually a good microcosm of how Haiti was forcibly deindustrialized during the US occupation and then cannibalized by the vultures that we call a fucking government. So take the story that I'm about to describe and then apply it to every other possible government-run industry that you can think of. Okay? The Gonaive Angery line was torn down in 1925, about a decade after the Americans showed up. The Au-Cap-Baon line was neglected by the duvaliers until it became unusable, at which point the Tonton Macoute and his cabinet just divided up the metal, wood, and rolling stock amongst themselves. The Léogane line was dismantled in 1983, this time by Baby Doc, world's youngest dictator. And finally, the half-finished Pétionville line that would also be butchered for parts, this time by American servicemen. However, to this day, you can actually still find a couple of steam locomotives in a depot in Port-au-Prince, as relics of a bygone era and evidence of just how far the colonial apparatus is willing to go to ensure hegemony. Now, the United States Administration for International Development, or USAID, was established under everybody's favorite flat earth lizard man, JFK. And it's basically a giant cabal of men in hoods that shadow out their faces, lighting candles, doing incantations, ritual sacrifice, and really anything they can think of as long as it keeps Haiti poor. So in the 80s, they undercut Haitian farmers by distributing free food, and as a result, local farmers had to watch their harvest rot, abandon their farms, and then go look for unemployment in urban centers, mostly Port-au-Prince. This meant that the capital was becoming continuously more crowded while food sovereignty becomes less and less attainable as a country. Now, this was instead of crop buyouts to stimulate local economies and keep farmers from going broke. Like, for far less money, they could have just bought up all the locally produced crops at a guaranteed price and then charged themselves with distributing it to where it needs to go. You want to know why they didn't? Now, I'm sure it has nothing to do with the fact that the rice they were dumping on Haiti was dangerously high in arsenic and cadmium, far above the legal limit to be sold in the United States, and double that of local product, as per the University of Michigan. Anyway, then they established large industrial parks like this one in the north of the country, called Caracol Industrial Park, under the guise of creating jobs and development. But in reality, they were just poorly constructed sweatshops kept profitable by suppressing Haitian minimum wage to keep Walmart t-shirts and American baseball tickets cheap, because God knows they need all the help they can get to get people in the door. That's right, throughout the 80s, 90s, and 2000s, disenfranchised Haitians were stitching your baseballs and sewing your jerseys. Thanks, Bill Clinton.
Helping in Kosovo, two men shaking hands, Clinton and Rugova. Thank you, USA. You are my best friend. You are the peacekeeper. You are the legend.
They also employed foreign NGOs to provide aid rather than training Haitian citizens. These NGOs were often simultaneously overfunded and ineffective, and in worst case, they're actively harming the community and perpetuating the issue that they nominally came to solve. Essentially, they would just pay high school's worth of white people to stand around for a few months, murder a local economic sector or two, then take a few photos with some black children and then leave. One such NGO was an orphanage that ran through Port-au-Prince, capitalizing on this large new population of children who had their parents killed by the US in one way or another, which ended up just being a recruitment pool for the founder. Allegedly. Don't trust third world orphanages run by white people. Just don't do it. Duvaliers are ousted in February of 1986. Henri Namfi becomes head of the transitional government and plans the election for November 29, 1987. That day, as Haitians line up to vote for their very first elected leader in 2 generations, agents whose motivations and affiliations are unknown just gave the polling spaces a good peppering. But what we do know is that the military was quick to close the polls and cancel the elections. So the election is held again the next year, and Leslie Manigat won, and not a single soul actually thought he was a legitimate leader, with a voter turnout of 10% or lower, and him winning with 50% of the votes in a 10-candidate pool. And that 10% figure is being generous. Some sources estimate as low as 4%, with cronies of politicians being the only ones who felt safe enough voting that time around. Now, here's a fun tidbit. This is also right when the Keon C waste disposal incident happened. So the city of Philadelphia burns their garbage because it takes less space, which is important for large cities because they don't always have space for a landfill. Now, you still have to dispose of the so-called fly ash from your incinerators, and after the garbage can of the East Coast, New Jersey, banned all imports of trash from the surrounding states, Philadelphia began to accumulate a massive backlog of fly ash. By the way, this was right after the EPA was created, so when they tried to ship it off to Virginia, the Carolinas, and Georgia, they all denied it. So they decided to try dump it off on a country that doesn't have an EPA. They planned to create a man-made island in the Bahamas made of just straight-up cancer dust. The thing is that the f***ing hippies at Greenpeace called ahead to the Bahamian government and told them about their plan, at which point the Bahamian Navy began patrolling the perimeter and blocking them from entering their waters. They then go on the world tour that nobody wanted, as illustrated here, changed the ship's manifesto to say that they were carrying topsoil fertilizer, end up dumping 4,000 tons of it on the shores of Haiti in a city called Gonaïves. But by the time the Haitian government realized what it was, they had already begun schlepping off to figure out what to do with the other 10,000 tons of fly ash. The ship then disappears for a while, but a suspiciously similar looking ship with a new coat of paint and a new name is found in Yugoslavia. It passes through the Suez Canal and makes one more attempt to dump the fly ash off on Sri Lanka. The The ship then disappears again for a few months. And when they find it again, it has a new name and it's empty. You get 3 seconds to guess what happened. They dumped it in the Indian Ocean. Corporate self-regulation works. Now, I only barely scratched the surface of the social murder of Haitians via the targeted execution of our agricultural sector, which of course therefore clips the wings of any other industry that we could hope to have in the country, thus making the country prime real estate, full of vulnerable people ready to be exploited in sweatshops, blood banks, orphanages, and more. Not to mention the poisoning of our food and soil, the assassination of our sovereignty, etc. But that will be a future video. But to recap, Haiti wasn't just some permanently cursed state doomed to the worst conditions imaginable simply by virtue of it being the first republic to be governed by black people. Rather, it was a country of determined industrialists, farmers, craftspeople, and sailors at the turn of the 20th century. And it was this exact identity that had to be assassinated for the colonial ethos to be, without exception, to maintain the justification for colonial powers to continue their occupation of the global south. This video should also serve as evidence that Haiti is not inherently doomed to poverty and that the situation that we see at present was manufactured and therefore can be unmade. But that's all I got for you today. I hope you enjoyed the video. Don't forget to subscribe and hit a good old dinger. I have a Patreon, and if you want to ensure that resources like this can continue to be made, please consider donating to make sure that I can eat, pray, love in these conditions. You get early access to vids, bonus content, alternate versions, and other such nonsense. Anyway, thanks for spending the last half hour with me. Peace, 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 peace.